As educators, one of the things we desire most is for our students to remember us. Positively, of course. We all have memories of teachers who have had a lasting impact on our lives. Margaret Mead once said, "Children must be taught how to think, not what to think." That's how I describe the teachers who had a lasting impact on me. In looking back at my life, I have been fortunate to have many fine teachers in the Worcester Public Schools where I grew up. You have to be from Worcester to pronounce it correctly. I had many other fine teachers at Holy Cross, Syracuse. Oh, Holy Cross. Let's hear it for Holy Cross. Go Crusaders. Oh, they're not Crusaders anymore. A good thing. Syracuse University and Harvard. However, one teacher who stood out for me, I never had in class. He was my uncle, a Jesuit priest and educator. Let's hear it for Jesuits. When I was a teenager, he cautioned me to always be skeptical of the dominant frames by which society addresses its perceived problems. That dominant frames can hide oppression and inequality. He related to me how when he was a seminarian in the late 30s, he could recall only one conversation concerning African Americans. And that centered around how they as priests should be converting more African Americans to Catholicism. He told me that was the wrong frame. He decried the lack of attention to racism, discrimination, and Jim Crow. He related how in some parts of the country, African Americans had to receive communion after whites. He was appalled. From his perspective, they were missing the most important issue, the need to confront racism in both society and the church. His lessons about frames has stayed with me throughout my career. As a young special educator, when I was being prepared to teach students with disabilities, one of the dominant themes espoused by many in my field was the theory of normalization. Using this frame, we were taught that our role as special educators was to enable students with disabilities to fit in, to be as normal as possible. That meant that deaf students were often discouraged from signing and forced into hours of therapy to read lips and to speak, with many of them never really accomplishing either, while they were denied access to natural language, sign language. Glad you're here today. This is the first, by the way, that we've had an interpreter at Convocation. Students with physical disabilities spent hours learning how to take a few steps, often being pulled out of academic classrooms. Dyslexic students were subjected to endless drills in phonics and spelling, while being denied access to great literature. Over time, I realized that that was the wrong frame. As Noni said in my introduction, I had the honor of being appointed the Director of Special Education during the Clinton administration. In that role, I worked with other appointees who headed up disability programs. There were about 20 of us, and I was the only one who did not have a disability. When we met monthly to talk about our programs and policies impacting the disability community, the email invitation read, "Disabled appointees plus Tom." They were inclusive. Though I had worked in special education my entire career, I was never in a position where I, a temporarily able-bodied person, a TAB, as many in the disability community refer to non-disabled people, was working primarily with people who had disabilities. Now that I'm older, I know how temporary my able-bodiedness was. Some of you know that, don't you? This was a great boundary crossing activity for me. I recall a meeting I had in 1994 in which I brought up a policy issue, the fact that students with disabilities were excluded from state and federal testing. As a country, we could not answer the question, are students with disabilities learning to read? Or are they becoming proficient in mathematics? I thought of this purely as a policy issue. My colleagues had a different frame. My boss, the noted disability activist, Judy Heumann, responded, "Don't you get it, Tom? It's ableism. They, meaning people without disabilities, don't believe we, people with disabilities, are capable." The rest of the group nodded in agreement. I had never heard the term, but quickly figured it out. Like racism, sexism, and homophobia, it is deeply held negative views of people based on group membership, attitudes that discriminate and oppress. This was an epiphany for me. It changed my frame. I saw how many of the practices that I and others in my field engaged in actually perpetuated ableism. Though well-meaning, we educators often focused on deficits, not strengths, and too often we ignored the unique gifts that students with disabilities brought with them because they had disabilities. The frame of ableism was a direct challenge to the frame of normalization that dominated my field. It became clear to me that we as educators needed to confront ableism just as we need to confront racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, and homophobia. We need to embrace students with disabilities for who they are and move forward to seek a world in which people with disabilities are respected and embraced. Recently, I came into possession of a trove of letters my uncle wrote to my mother and others in my family. As I read these letters that spanned 5 decades, letters are really good things. People should still write them. I could see how my uncle changed his frames throughout his career. As a young seminarian in India in the late 30s, he thought about his career as converting Hindus and Muslims to Christianity. He enthusiastically accepted this call. However, as his career evolved, it became clear to me that his frames had changed. He founded a high school and university in Baghdad, Iraq, Al-Hikma University. The school not only enrolled Christians of several denominations, but also Muslims, both Sunni and Shia. And when you think about Baghdad today, it might be surprising that 7% of the students in the school were Jewish. And in a radical move for its time and place, the school enrolled women. His letters never talked about conversion, but rather he spoke of the beauties of Islam. Another letter he wrote concerned a boat trip he took from Europe shortly after World War II. Holocaust survivors heading to Israel mostly populated the ship. My uncle marveled at their faithfulness as they celebrated Shabbat, given all they had been through. He spoke of his deep respect for Judaism and the Jewish people. As I researched his school more, it was evident that my missionary uncle did not seem interested in converting anyone. None other than the powerful Cardinal of Boston, Cardinal Cushing, publicly criticized the Jesuits in Iraq for not converting a single person, calling their vocations wasted. However, another article I found, written by a Muslim, part of the Iraqi diaspora here in the United States, provided a counter-narrative. He spoke glowingly of the school, remembering how transformative it was to be educated alongside Christians and Jews. He stated that for him, this was America. Saddam Hussein closed the school in 1968, expelling the American Jesuits. Clearly, their frame of acceptance of difference conflicted with his political philosophy of pitting one group against another, as fascists typically do. However, the example of Al-Hikmah University, of a school being a place where difference was acknowledged and celebrated, where boundaries were crossed for the betterment of all, is as relevant today as it was in the 50s and 60s. It was and continues to be the right frame. So, class of 2019, be the educators your students remember by teaching them how to think, not what to think. Be the educator who recognizes the power of education to cross boundaries. Be the educator willing to question dominant frames as you promote equity and inclusion for the betterment of all. Thank you very much, and congratulations.